morning and greetings from Northumberland on the Friday the 4th of December, this first Friday in Advent. It's just before sunrise on a cool but now dry morning after a really rainy night, and we've avoided the snow that was promised, at least in the area. It'll be interesting when the sun really rises to see if there's any snow on the top of the Cheviots. And so ends the weather report. What's it like where you're waking up? Today the church, as it often does, has two saints to celebrate, and there's no saint to celebrate tomorrow. Today we've got St. John of Damascus and also Nicholas Ferrer, both of which have interesting stories. So I'm going to do John today and Nicholas tomorrow, simply because it makes sense to do that, and that's the order in which they lived. St. John died about 750 in that early Christian period, in the first millennium, 700 years or so after the death of Jesus. And he was born into a fairly affluent Arab Christian family. That's important to state as well, because it reminds us that Christianity was there in Arab lands, in Eastern lands, at the time when Christianity was only just beginning in the last couple of hundred years to be firmly established in our own land. He lived at a time when Islam had begun, Islam had risen, and he lived under the Islamic rule, under the Caliphate, and indeed his father had a role of responsibility in that government. And actually, he was free to teach and to preach, because in some way he was protected from some of the rules of the church. We'll come to that later on. But it wasn't always easy, and after a time he withdrew from the court where he had some employment, and he settled in the Judean desert and lived his life as a monk. Now, his teachings were important. He was a great hymn writer. Come ye faithful, raise the strain of triumphant gladness. That great Easter hymn was written by him. But the writing he is most remembered for is his writing about icons. Now, as you can see, because you join me, icons are important to me. We have our icons up here on the shelf and on the table, and they're part of the prayer corner in this house. And John lived at a time when the established church was questioning icons, and indeed many people were smashing them and destroying them, rather as in the Puritan revolution in England 700 years later, when marvellous pieces of work were smashed up by people. And John wrote very powerfully about the fact that God had made a world where there were craftsmen and artists, and he gave to people the skills, and those skills should be employed in serving God. So that just as a writer of a book could be employed in serving God by writing a book, so a painter, an artist, a craftsperson could be employed in serving God, in making their craft. And that these icons helped us to see through and beyond them into the reality of God's love for us. And he was able to do this at a time when many people who thought as he thought were opposed, because the authorities couldn't get to him because he was behind, if you like, an Islamic wall. And it's interesting that the very oldest icons that still exist, many of which are in the monastery on Mount Sinai, because that too was protected by an Islamic shield from the destruction that other parts of the church faced. It's worth remembering those sort of things. But let's go back to John. He lived out a life seeking to be close to God, and he preached and proclaimed the use of icons as a part of prayer. And I think that's very important, because again in our generation, in the West, we're rediscovering the power and the value of the icons that the Eastern Church uses to speak to us of our fellowship with the saints, to speak to us of the powerful, powerful realities of prayer. So as we remember John today, we use our icons, we note our icons as a sign of that communication with God. But we're also reading from Isaiah, and I've gone on a bit this morning, so I'm going to read from Isaiah 29, today's passage. And again, it's about the lowly being lifted and the powerful being called to account. Shall not Lebanon in a very little while become a fruitful field, and a fruitful field be regarded as a forest? On that day the deaf shall hear the words of a scroll, and out of their gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see. The meek shall obtain fresh joy in the Lord, and the neediest people shall exult in the Holy One of Israel. For the tyrant shall be no more, and the scoffer shall cease to be. All those alert to do evil shall be cut off, and those who cause a person to lose a lawsuit, who set a trap for the arbiter in the gate, and without grounds deny justice to the one in the right. Therefore says the Lord, who redeemed Abraham, concerning the house of Jacob, no longer shall Jacob be ashamed, no longer shall his face grow pale. For when he sees his children, the work of my hands in his midst, they will sanctify my name, they will sanctify the Holy One of Jacob, and will stand in awe of the God of Israel. And those who err in spirit will come to understanding, and those who grumble will accept instruction. May God bless us today.